We're going to be trying out a new type of content. I really enjoy making series about things that I find really interesting, and Mad Lads has been a hell of a success, so why not add some others to the pile? And one thing that I've been asked for a hell of a lot was Celtic myths. Things like mythical creatures, legends, and fables from Celtic folklore. And it seems like a lot of you really wanted that as well. Now, this isn't going to be like Ancient Aliens where I try and pretend that any of this stuff is real, right? Remember, these are all just fables and legends. But they are very interesting and entertaining, and it's fun learning about ancient Celtic history and legends. And who knows, you might learn a little bit of Gaelic along the way. So, to get started, let's look at a type of creature that you should always be on the lookout for whenever you're near any rivers or lochs. Kelpies. But before we get into the video, it's in fact your boy, Raid Shadow Legends. With millions of champion combinations and countless tactics to master, there is no end to the different ways you can fight raid bosses, do dungeon runs, battle in the campaign, or compete in the PvP arena. With hundreds of artifacts to buff up your boys and over 600 champions with unique skills, you can fight your battles the way you want. The Arbiter fought a pack of really nasty bad guys a long time ago, but she wasn't strong enough to put an end to them herself, so instead she locked them up in a massive tower prison until she figured out how to deal with them. It's been a few thousand years now, and the challenge still awaits. There is not much time since the Doom Tower is failing, and it's up to you to go in there and stop the prisoners from getting out. To climb to the top, you're going to need an army of champions. The regular Doom Tower floors tend to be fairly easy to deal with if you've got a strong team, but the bosses are really tough, and a couple of them will need you to use specific mechanics or your team will be wiped. Experiment and see what works. And as usual, one of my ultimate favourite things to do in Raid Shadow Legends is challenging other players in the PvP arena. So if you want a starting boost in Raid, hit the link down below or scan the QR code on the screen to get unique bonuses worth $30, which include 200,000 silver, an XP booster, an energy refill, an ancient shard, and the epic champion Vergis, so you can summon a great champion as soon as you get into the game. These rewards are only available to new players and only for the next 30 days, and you can find these rewards here in your inbox. Kelpies are essentially evil, aquatic, spectral horses with magical powers that they would use to lure, capture, and kill their victims. Their name means colt, which of course is also the name for a young male horse, adding to the belief that Kelpies are almost exclusively male. The goal of a Kelpie apparently is to find companionship with humans, though this very often does not work out well for the humans, since Kelpies are extremely likely to kill you. They will be nice at first to lure you in, but after that they get a little bit murdery. Kelpies were thought to live in lochs, pools and rivers all over Scotland, and that there are so many Kelpies that every single loch had its own story about them, or sometimes multiple stories. Kelpies are actually the most common water spirit in Celtic folklore, with some accounts saying that every body of water has its own Kelpie. Many of these stories describe the appearance and characteristics of a Kelpie. They would often appear as a black, dark grey or white horse. Their fur was described as being sticky, similar to the texture of a spider's web, and their mane would always look soaking wet even after they hadn't been in the water for hours. And also, their hooves were said to be reversed compared to our normal horses. There were all kinds of wives' tales about how to spot a Kelpie, and there were also reports of sightings, which, of course, we know for a fact are a lot of shite, but if you were a simple local farmer, you would instantly become a lot more interesting if you told people that you saw and survived a Kelpie. But the truth is, if we are going by the lore, if you actually came across a Kelpie, your chances of survival were pretty much zero. Kelpies are 10 times as strong as any ordinary horse, and they could also change their size, often stretching their backs to allow for more people to sit on them and ride them. Now, why would a Kelpie want people to ride it? Well, this was how they lured their victims. Horse thievery was very much a thing, and if people saw a horse just roaming free on its own with no one else around and no sign of the owner, well, free horse. And they would jump on its back so they could steal it. In order to be more enticing, a Kelpie would show itself at the edge of a loch to a tired traveller or someone who was a little bit worse for wear as they were coming home from the pub, knowing full well that they wouldn't be able to resist an easy ride. Kelpies would also lure children who were out playing due to a child's willingness to approach a wild animal and having no awareness of the danger that they were putting themselves in. The Kelpie would also make itself approachable by acting calmly and at times affectionate, which tricked people into a false sense of security. But once the victim or victims were sat on the Kelpie, or even if they just touched it so that they could pet it or something, they wouldn't be able to let go or get off. The Kelpie's fur would actually fuse to them like a sticky spider web, and they would be stuck and unable to escape. The Kelpie's calm and friendly attitude would then immediately change to something almost demonic. And then the Kelpie would jump into the water, dragging its victims down into its depths, where it would then drown them. As I mentioned earlier, Kelpies had magical powers which were attuned to water. These powers would allow them to do things such as riding on the water's surface or summoning waves and floods to quickly drown their victims. They would apparently do this if a group of people either camped, travelled through, or tried to settle in an area which invaded the Kelpie's territory. Another belief at the time was once a Kelpie's tail was submerged in water, there would be a rumble of thunder, and if anyone could hear a howling or shrieking sound, then people thought that that was a Kelpie unintentionally warning everyone of an incoming storm. Now, obviously, when it comes to mythology, you come across a lot of different accounts and descriptions of the same creature. People had varying experiences and descriptions of what Kelpies are, and there is some debate as to whether Kelpies were sometimes confused with the much more vicious Anikushka, or more simply known as the water horse, since they are almost identical. The Anikushka sort of is a Kelpie, or a type of Kelpie, because they have pretty much the exact same characteristics and powers, but the Anikushka is a lot more powerful and a lot more evil. Also, during this series we're going to be speaking a little bit of Gaelic, and one of the first rules of Gaelic is, as you can clearly see, whatever way the words look like they're pronounced, that's not how they're pronounced. The Anikushka has a lot of stories of its own, and it's also the only type of Kelpie where there are stories of it being killed. In one such story, a blacksmith's daughter was killed by an Anikushka, and he had to watch her being dragged into the loch because he couldn't save her in time. The next day, the blacksmith went to the loch and saw his daughter's entrails spread across the shore. So, the blacksmith and his son swore revenge on the monster. They took to their forge and made a bunch of large, sharp hooks, and then they camped by the side of the loch and roasted a sheep, hoping that the smell would attract the beast. While the blacksmith and his son were hiding nearby, they also left the hooks in the fire so they would be red hot. And then a mist began to rise from the loch, and the beast appeared and lunged for the sheep. The blacksmith and his son jumped out and rammed the red-hot hooks into the Anikushka's body, and then they fought with the creature all night. And by morning, they had killed it. And then its body disintegrated and turned into a jelly-like substance. Another story which is a little harder to pin down is apparently Anikushka was killed by a man after it tried to seduce his sister. This is another thing that Kelpies do, but more on that later. And some reports say that this happened on the Isle of Lewis, but other reports say that it happened on the mainland, and the location that the creature was slain was then called Kniok Nabesht, or the hillock of the monster, where apparently some standing stones were erected to keep the beast sealed away. The problem is, during our research, we couldn't actually find this location, not on the Isle of Lewis or on the mainland. But this Anikushka apparently lived in Loch Avulin, which is a real loch that is on the mainland. So the location of the hillock of the monster should be somewhere in this area, but we haven't been able to find its exact location. Also, it's possible that this story was actually referenced in The Witcher 3 during the quest, The Whispering Hillock, where you allow an ancient spirit to escape the hillock by allowing it to possess a black horse. So, maybe this was a reference to this story, maybe it wasn't, but the similarities with the hillock and an evil demon inside a black horse, it's pretty similar. Now, you're probably wondering what happens after the Kelpie pulls its victims to a watery grave. Well, some say that the Kelpies would then eat their prey and then they would throw up their entrails along the edge of the loch or riverside as a way of marking their territory. But other people believed that if a person was caught and dragged into the water by a Kelpie, they would simply vanish. In a famous story, a group of young boys who were the sons of clan chieftains from the Western Isles set out on a fishing expedition in the Hebrides. And while they were on the fishing trip, the sons had spotted a Kelpie from a distance on the Isle of Muck, which, yes, is a real Scottish island. And they described it as being a beautiful creature that was as white as the froth of the waves, and they noted that on their approach it was gentle and whinnied softly. The Kelpie instantly showed affection towards them, even allowing them to pet it. One of the sons thought that the horse must be lost because no one on this island could possibly be rich enough to own such a magnificent steed. So the sons decided to take it for a ride. Each of the chieftain's sons got on the back of the Kelpie and waited patiently for all of them to be seated comfortably. Until one of the group petted the Kelpie on the neck, and he noticed that his hand was stuck, and no matter what he did, he couldn't remove it. The Kelpie then bolted straight towards the water. One of the sons knew that the only way he could free himself would be to cut off his own fingers. So he did, and once his hand was free, he leapt from the Kelpie and escaped. And as he looked back, he saw that the Kelpie was no longer on land, but was actually galloping on the surface of the sea, heading towards a huge whirlpool. The entrance to the other world. The last thing that the lone survivor heard was the other chieftain's sons laughing with joy as if they were in some kind of trance before they were pulled into the whirlpool by the Kelpie, never to be seen or heard from again. Now, the other world is something that we're going to talk about a lot if we continue with this series, so I'll give a brief explanation. In Celtic mythology, bodies of water were seen as portals to the other world. There are other ways to get into the other world, but right now let's focus on water because it's kind of the main one. And as for what the other world is, well, I'll do my best to try and explain it, but it is ambiguous as fuck. It's sort of like heaven and hell. It's sort of like a part of our realm and a whole other parallel universe. It's a place of great joy and great suffering. It's a place of great beauty and great horror. It's the afterlife and it's purgatory. It's part of our reality and it's a whole different reality. It can also be all of the things I just described and also none of the things I just described. And it can also be any of these things all at the same time and also not. I hope that clears everything up. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. I did say it was ambiguous. The main thing that we do know for a fact about the other world is it's where the gods live. But it's also where monsters live. So it sometimes gets called the realm of gods and horrors. And sometimes monsters cross the veil, so the surface of the water, and come into our world. Which is why in Celtic mythology, a lot of mythical creatures are associated with water, or at least living near water. It's also where some Celtic customs and rituals come from. One ritual being throwing precious possessions into water, so throwing them into the other world as an offering to the gods in order to win their favour. This could be for a good harvest or for them to lend you their strength for an upcoming battle. And such ritual sites have been found all over Britain, and all kinds of artefacts have been found, and one of the most famous being the Battersea Shield, which was retrieved from a riverbed at one of these ritual sites alongside a bunch of other artefacts. I hope that one wasn't for a favour in battle, because I mean, if you were going into battle, you probably should have kept your shield. And there is something related to this that we still do today that is based on this old custom. Wishing fountains. You throw something of value into the water and make a wish, or ask for the god's favour. There are actually quite a few Celtic rituals that we still do today without realising it. Some of them we don't talk about. But yeah, we were talking about Kelpies. The worst and most dangerous power of a Kelpie was their ability to transform into a human. Most of the time, they would turn into an adult male. But there were still ways to tell if the person you were talking to was a Kelpie, like if they smelled like a river or a loch, or if they had water weeds in their hair, or sand on them anywhere. There were also other tales that said a Kelpie's human form would still have hooves for feet, even after they had transformed. But these tales might have been due to Christianity and how people characterised the devil and demons at the time as men with hooves for feet. One of the ways the Kelpie would lure people in is by taking on the look of an old wise man in need or a fisherman who would find a way to bring someone close to the edge of the water. And as soon as they came close enough, it would be too late. The man would pull them into the water with his great strength and drown them. Kelpies were also known to lure women by appearing as a handsome man that would bond with the woman by putting her under a love spell. The Kelpie would then shed a single tear and would ask the woman to wipe it away for him. But once she touched him, that was it. She was stuck and would get dragged into the water. Not all Kelpies would take the time to be subtle. Some of them were far too desperate to take their victims than to wait for them to be lured in by some trickery. Some of them would just take the form of a huge muscular man that would attack and drag people kicking and screaming into the water. And of course, the easiest bait of all, the Kelpie would transform into a beautiful naked woman who was bathing in the water. And she would give nearby travellers the fuck me eyes and invite them to join her. At which point she would then immediately drown and kill them. So sometimes the Kelpies hunted simps.
Clever girl.
There was, however, a problem for the Kelpie, as it could only remain in human form while the sun was down. It was thought that anyone who witnessed the actual transformation would instantly be freed of the Kelpie's trance spell. Kelpies would become more desperate and impatient to find a kill as it got closer to sunrise because they were running out of time, or they would just go back into the loch before the sun rose. It is extremely rare to find a story where a Kelpie is seen in a neutral light, and for obvious reason, they are mostly portrayed as purely evil. But in one story from the island of Barra, a lonely Kelpie was more interested in actually finding companionship than finding a victim. It shapeshifted into a good-looking man, as Kelpies do, in order to draw the attention of a local woman that he wanted to marry. The woman, however, knew the signs to look out for, and while they were both talking, she realised that she was talking to a Kelpie. Then later, when she found the man sleeping, she removed his necklace, which was really his transformed bridle, and once it was removed, he shifted back into his horse form. She then took the Kelpie to her father, who forced the Kelpie to work on his farm for over a year. I mean, after all, he had just obtained a horse that was 10 times stronger than any regular horse. Of course he's going to make the most of it. Later, the woman took the Kelpie to see a wise man, where the woman was told to give the Kelpie his necklace back so that he could return to his human form. When the Kelpie turned back into a man, the wise man asked him if he would rather continue to live as a Kelpie or become a mortal man. And the Kelpie responded by asking the woman that had enslaved him to marry him. She agreed to the marriage, and they lived happily ever after. It's a little bit simpy, to cuck yourself to the woman that kept you as a slave for a year, but, at least we got a Kelpie story that didn't end in a grisly death. Now, considering how rare it was for anyone to actually escape a Kelpie, they apparently did have a couple of weaknesses. As mentioned in the story you just heard, if someone was to remove the bridle of a Kelpie, it was thought that whoever took the bridle would have complete control over the Kelpie. Though, in other stories, the control they had would only last for a single day, and the person that took the bridle would die if they didn't return it. Another theory and long-standing trope of dealing with mythological creatures is to use a silver bullet. Some said that this would turn the Kelpie into a harmless, fleshy mass, but Kelpie stories go back way, way, way before the discovery of firearms, so I'm calling complete bullshit on that one. Also, apparently the use of crosses and prayer against the Kelpie could make it back off, but I'm also going to put that one down to Christianity arriving in Britain and trying to supplant Celtic paganism. The origin of the Kelpie is believed to be rooted in human sacrifices to the gods, as people and animals were usually sacrificed into bodies of water. Though, with the eventual decline and lost practices of Celtic paganism, this myth was eventually used, as very many other myths have been, to scare children. In this case, to stop them from playing near rivers and lochs so they don't drown. Another way this myth was used was to deter thieves from stealing your horses. If the thieves thought that it might be a Kelpie, then they might be a little less inclined to go anywhere near it. Especially since Kelpies were described as looking like top-tier horses, which would have been worth a large amount of money. Another way this myth was used was due to jealousy, because it may have been used by husbands to scare their wives away from talking to attractive men, because, careful, he might be a Kelpie. Kelpies were also mentioned by the famed Scottish poet Rabbie Burns in a section of his poem called Address to the Devil. And it reads as follows. When thous dissolve the snowy herd and float the jingling icy bird, then water kelpies haunt the ford by your direction, and nighted travellers are allured to their destruction. This is related in name only, but just outside of Falkirk there are two sculptures named the Kelpies, which were unveiled in April of 2014 and were an excellent use of my tax money. However, these are more of a monument to Scotland's horse-powered industrial heritage instead of being a monument to actual Kelpies. So I'm just testing the waters with this new type of content, if you will. Excuse the pun. If Celtic myths ends up becoming quite popular, then I will add it as a series to the channel. But I'm just going to let you know, before we begin, that if we do this as a series, I'm not doing it Ancient Alien style, right? We aren't going to be pulling any of that, so did a magic horse fuck my wife, right? We're not doing any of that, right? It's not going to happen that way. These are fables, legends, and stories. And that is all they are. But they are interesting and educational, and I hope all of you enjoy them. So, if you want to see more of these and you would like to see Celtic myths being added to the channel, then leave a like, leave a comment, leave your mum's phone number, and if the feedback is good, we'll launch this as a series.
It's Count Dankula on YouTube! Everybody subscribe!